That makes a lot of sense. So, what does this all mean for markets? I guess it's hard to tell, and it depends on the data that comes forward. But I imagine at least for the next few months, it seems that things are probably quite positive, constructive, potentially going the same trajectory. And then after that, depending on the data, it could go
Yeah.
down.
So,
What are your thoughts?
right. So I think that your interpretation is largely correct. And I just want to make a distinction of, the word markets, right? When we say markets, or most people say markets, that generally refers to the S&P 500. And we have to remember that the S&P 500 is a combination of the 500 largest companies, and it's disproportionately impacted by the top 10 companies, which at this point are very much service sector oriented companies in the form of Google and Apple. And while sometimes they produce hardware products like iPhones, they very much have subscription like revenues that are impacted or tied mostly to that lagging or services economy bucket. If you go to smaller industries, like if you take the Russell 2000 small cap index, that represents 2000 companies, which is about 60 or 70% of the investable universe. Those companies are roughly at the same level today as they were in 2021. So they've gone basically 3 years with no increases in their share prices as a group. And that's primarily because of those slowdowns that we're seeing in that cyclical bucket, because since those are more industries that are tied to the real economy as opposed to the more monopolistic companies that make up the S&P 500. And if you go one level smaller than that to the micro cap index, which is represented by something like an ETF IWC, it's the Russell Microcap Index, those stocks are lower today than they were in 2021. So you can see sort of how the economy moves in a sequence where you have leading, cyclical, aggregate, and lagging data. The contractions appear in the leading, they spread to the cyclical, then they spread to the aggregate, and then they spread to the lagging. The same type of phenomenon appears in markets where contractions start with the smallest, least healthy or least dominant companies. They spread to slightly larger companies. Then they spread to only last the more monopolistic S&P 500 companies. So I would expect the trends that we're seeing in the markets to persist, but what that means is probably still really weak performance for your micro caps, small companies, since they're going to be very tied to the more cyclical real economy sectors, which are starting to experience contractions. Eventually, it will show up more dominantly in the small cap indexes, which are still not performing that well, really no gains over the last 3 years. The largest S&P 500 companies, so long as that aggregate economy bucket remains pretty stable and roughly around trend, which it is right now, will continue to move higher as those company profits will continue to do quite well. So, we have to, I think, get a little bit more granular when we talk about markets, unless we're just only talking about the S&P 500. In that case, the trends, I think, probably do continue as long as those aggregate economy statistics that I referenced in those charts remain stable and remain roughly at trend levels. Then the S&P 500 will do well. But we should also keep in the back of our mind, although it's not as heavily invested in, the trends that are in the microcap index as well as the small cap index, because those will be somewhat leading indicators of what happens in the larger companies, just as the leading economic indicators as well as the cyclical economic indicators are leading indicators of what will come for the aggregate and lagging economy bucket.